It was a cold autumn evening when I first stepped into the old library. The building stood tall and mysterious, tucked away in a corner of the city, almost as if it was forgotten by time itself. I had walked past it countless times before, never really paying attention to the weathered stone walls or the tall, iron-framed windows. But tonight, something was different. The air felt heavier, and the usual bustle of the city seemed to fade away as I approached the library's entrance. I had recently moved to the city and was looking for a quiet place to spend my evenings. The library seemed like the perfect spot, a peaceful refuge from the chaos of life. As I entered, a musty smell greeted me, the kind that only old buildings can have, mixed with the scent of aged paper and ink. The large wooden doors creaked shut behind me, sealing me inside with the faint sound of whispers. The interior of the library was vast, stretching far beyond what I could see at first glance. Rows upon rows of dusty bookshelves filled the room, their contents appearing untouched for years. A tall chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and the dim lighting made everything seem more surreal. The silence was so profound that I could hear the ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance, each second stretching on longer than the last. I made my way to the back of the library, where the oldest section was rumored to be. The books here were ancient, some of them so old that the pages were fragile and yellowed with age. The shelves were packed with stories from a time long past, stories that hadn't seen the light of day for decades. I couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward them, as if the books themselves were calling me. As I walked deeper into the section, my eyes were drawn to a particular book. It was resting on a shelf, slightly out of place among the others, its cover covered in dust. The title was barely legible, but something about it intrigued me. I reached out and pulled it off the shelf, feeling a chill run down my spine as I touched the worn cover. The moment my fingers made contact with the book, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and I shivered involuntarily. I flipped the book open to the first page, the brittle paper crackling under my fingers. The text was written in an old flowing script, the letters almost dancing before my eyes. It told the story of a mysterious event that took place in the library many years ago. According to the book, there were rumors that the library wasn't just a place for books, but a gateway to something darker, something that could reach out from the pages and into the real world. As I read, I became aware of a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. I looked around, but the library was as still as ever, the shadows dancing quietly in the corners. The only sound was the soft rustling of the pages as I turned them. But then, just as I reached a particularly eerie passage, the lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wasn't alone in the library anymore. I wasn't sure how I knew it, but it was as if the air had shifted, as if the library itself was alive, aware of my presence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The book held me captive, as though it had taken root in my mind. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible at first, drifting through the silence of the room. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, And though I couldn't make out the words, it was clear that it was coming from somewhere within the library. I could feel the breath of the voice, cold and eerie, on the back of my neck. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by an invisible force. The book in my hands seemed to hum with an unsettling energy, as if it was alive and beckoning me deeper into its secrets. I had to know more. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread, despite the fear creeping up my spine, I turned the page, and that's when I saw it. The figure, standing at the end of the aisle. At first, it was a mere shadow, but as I blinked, it became clearer. A tall, gaunt figure dressed in dark, tattered clothing, its face obscured by a hood. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, watching me with a presence that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away. The book slipped from my hands and fell to the ground with a loud thud, but the figure didn't react. It just stood there, still and silent, as though waiting for something. The atmosphere in the library grew heavier, the air thick with an unnatural cold. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to get out of there. As I turned to leave, the whispering returned, louder this time, and it seemed to follow me, echoing through the empty halls of the library. With every step I took, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. And just as I reached the door, I swore I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I didn't make it out of the library as quickly as I had hoped. The heavy door creaked as I pushed it open, but when I stepped outside, I was met with an eerie silence. The city was strangely quiet, the usual sounds of traffic and distant voices absent. The cold air bit at my skin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced back at the library, half expecting to see the tall figure still standing in the shadows. But the door was closed. The library just as silent and dark as it had been when I entered. I couldn't stop thinking about that book, the way it felt in my hands, the unsettling energy it radiated. I was convinced it wasn't just a story. Something about it, the way the figure had stood motionless in the shadows, watching me, was far too real. It haunted me in a way I couldn't explain, like the memory of a nightmare that lingers long after you wake. The next day, I returned. I couldn't help myself. I had to know more. As I walked through the front doors once again, the musty smell of the old books greeted me. But today, something was different. The air felt thick, heavy, with an almost palpable sense of dread. The librarian at the desk looked up as I entered, giving me a tight-lipped smile. She didn't say anything, but her eyes lingered on me a little too long, almost like she was warning me to turn back. But I didn't. I walked deeper into the library, my footsteps echoing off the stone floors, the sound too loud in the unnatural silence. I went straight for the section where I had found the book. My heart raced with each step, but I couldn't stop. I needed to understand what had happened, what was happening. As I passed the shelves, I noticed that the books I had seen the night before were now in different places, some even missing. But I didn't stop to look closer. The urge to find the book again was overwhelming, and when I reached the shelf, I saw that it was still there, exactly where I had left it. The title, still barely legible, seemed to beckon me forward, as if it knew I would return. I pulled the book from the shelf, but this time I didn't feel the same chill I had the night before. The air didn't drop in temperature, and the shadows didn't seem to grow longer. Still, I hesitated for a moment before opening it. This time, the words seemed to dance on the page, more vivid, more alive than they had been the first time. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read the words. This library holds more than books. It holds memories. And not all memories are meant to be remembered. I turned the page, and the story continued with a chilling account of an event that took place in the library decades ago. It was the story of a librarian, a man named Elias, who had spent years working in the very library I was standing in. He was obsessed with finding a way to communicate with the spirits that lingered within the books. He believed that the library wasn't just a place for knowledge, but a portal to something darker. He had conducted experiments, reading aloud from certain texts, hoping to unlock the doors to another realm. At first, nothing happened. But one night, in the dead of winter, he read aloud from a forbidden book, one that had been locked away in the deepest part of the library. It was said to be cursed, its words imbued with the power to summon things from beyond. When Elias read the words aloud, something stirred in the air. At first, it was a whisper, a murmur that he couldn't make out. But then the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they surrounded him, and Elias realized too late that he had made a grave mistake. The book had opened a door, and through that door, something had come. The whispers were no longer just voices in the air. They were something more, something corporeal. Elias had become obsessed with the entity that had crossed over. He believed it was a spirit bound to the library, its presence tied to the books and the knowledge they contained. But what he didn't understand was that the entity was not just a spirit. It was a being of pure darkness, one that fed on fear and knowledge. The story ended with a final horrifying warning. If you disturb the balance, the entity will return. And once it returns, it will never leave. As I read the last words, a strange feeling washed over me, like I was being pulled into the story. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. The library around me seemed to fade, the shelves blurring into darkness. I looked up from the book, my hands trembling. That's when I saw it again. The figure. This time, it wasn't just standing in the shadows. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward me. Its tall, gaunt form emerged from the darkness between the rows of books, its face still hidden by a hood. I froze, unable to move, my eyes locked on the figure as it drew closer. The whispering started again, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I tried to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was paralyzed, trapped in place as the figure stepped closer. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. It was as if it was searching for something it had been waiting for. And then, without warning, it spoke. Its voice was low, almost a growl, but I could understand it clearly. You shouldn't have come back. The words sent a jolt of terror through my entire body, and I stumbled backward, the book falling from my hands. I reached out, desperate to grab it, but as soon as I touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through my fingers, forcing me to pull away. The figure stepped forward again, its long, thin fingers reaching out toward me. I knew I had to escape. I had to get out of there, but the door, the exit, seemed miles away. I turned and ran, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound of my footsteps drowned out by the growing whispering that surrounded me. The library seemed to stretch on forever, its labyrinthine aisles twisting and turning, trapping me inside. As I neared the door, I saw it again, the figure standing just beyond the threshold. It was waiting for me, blocking the only way out. "You cannot leave," it whispered, its voice a distorted hiss. I stopped in my tracks, my chest tightening with fear. The room was spinning around me, the walls closing in as if the library itself was alive, pulling me in deeper. The figure reached out one final time, its fingers grazing my shoulder. The chill of its touch seeped into my skin, freezing me in place. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. And then, everything went black. I woke up in a cold sweat, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I lay in the darkness. For a few moments, I didn't know where I was, my mind trying to piece together the nightmare that had just plagued me. The library, the figure, the whispers, it all felt so real. My hands trembled as I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, flicking it on. The warm light of the bulb felt like a lifeline, grounding me to reality. But no matter how much I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, it clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't stop thinking about the library, about the terrifying entity that had somehow followed me back from that cursed place. I needed to clear my head, get out of the house, do something to take my mind off it. I dressed quickly and went for a walk, hoping that the crisp morning air would help me forget. But as I walked through the empty streets, the nagging sense of unease didn't leave me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. I decided to head back to the library, determined to get answers. I didn't know what else to do. The dreams, the visions, the whispers, they all felt like they were connected to something deeper, something I wasn't understanding. It was almost like the library itself was trying to reach me, trying to pull me back in. As I arrived at the entrance, the old building stood before me like a dark, looming monument. The heavy doors creaked open, but this time, I didn't hesitate. I walked inside with a sense of purpose, trying to ignore the chill in the air that seemed to follow me inside. The librarian was at her desk again, her gaze briefly meeting mine before she turned away, as though she were trying to pretend she hadn't seen me. I walked past her, moving deeper into the library. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, rows upon rows of books stacked high. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. But it wasn't the silence that bothered me. It was the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. But I couldn't deny that the library felt different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I moved through the aisles, trying to find the section where I had discovered the cursed book. But it wasn't there. At least, not in the place I remembered. Panic started to rise in my chest as I frantically searched the shelves. My hands shook as I scanned the titles, but the book was nowhere to be found. I walked in circles, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I was certain that the book had been here. It had to be. As I reached the farthest corner of the library, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, in the dim light, was a small hidden alcove, tucked away behind a set of heavy curtains. My heart skipped a beat as I walked toward it, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the whispers from my dream began to return, faint at first, then growing louder and more urgent. I pushed aside the curtains, and there it was. The book. It sat on a pedestal, bathed in a soft, eerie light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. The pages were cracked and yellowed, the cover dark with age, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same book, the one that had caused all of this, the one that had opened the door to whatever nightmare had begun to unfold around me. As I reached out to touch it, a sharp sound echoed through the library. A low growl, like something from deep within the walls, reverberated in the air. I froze, my hand hovering above the book, the chill of fear spreading through my veins. The whispers grew louder, now clear and distinct, as if they were speaking directly into my mind. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were unmistakable. They sent a wave of terror crashing through me, but I couldn't turn away. I had to know. I had to understand. I picked up the book, and as my fingers brushed against the cover, a jolt of energy shot through me, sending a shockwave of cold across my body. The room seemed to shift around me, the shadows deepening, the walls stretching. And then I heard it, the sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A voice, low and guttural, coming from somewhere in the darkness. The library never forgets. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the oppressive darkness, the weight of the silence that felt like it was closing in on me. And then, without warning, I saw him again. The figure. He was standing at the far end of the alcove, his tall, gaunt form emerging from the shadows. The same hooded figure I had seen in my dreams. His presence like a weight in the air. His eyes glowed faintly from beneath the hood, two burning embers that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "You should have stayed away," he said, his voice deep and resonant, filled with a chilling finality. His words sent a wave of cold through me, paralyzing me with fear. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. It was like the library had become a trap, its walls closing in on me. I could feel the weight of the book in my hands, its pages burning against my skin. The figure stepped closer, his movement slow, deliberate, as if savoring my fear. "It's too late now," he whispered. His breath, cold and ragged, sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel the presence of something else now, something darker, something that was drawing closer with every passing second. I dropped the book, and as it hit the ground, the entire library seemed to tremble. The figure moved toward me, his face still hidden, but his presence overwhelming. The whispers grew louder, the voices of the library, the voices of those who had come before me, all speaking at once, and among them I heard a single word, repeated over and over again, growing louder with each repetition. "Run." I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the cold stone floors as the library seemed to stretch on forever. The figure's voice echoed in the halls, the whispers chasing me, growing louder and more frantic with every step. I didn't know if I would make it out alive. I didn't know if I could ever escape the library, or if it would follow me forever. But I had to try. As I reached the exit, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The figure stood in the shadows, watching me, waiting for me to come back. And then The door slammed shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. But I knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. I stood there, breathless, my heart hammering in my chest as the heavy wooden door of the library slammed shut behind me. The echoes of my frantic footsteps faded as I stumbled backward, away from the cold stone walls that had once seemed so comforting. The smell of old books and dust that had always been a familiar presence now felt suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I had escaped. But for how long? I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to appear in the doorway, his eyes burning through the dark, but there was nothing. No figure, no shadows, only the quiet hum of the night. I tried to calm myself, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but the unease was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The whispers, they were still in my ears, their voices just beneath the surface of my thoughts, relentless and insistent. You shouldn't have come back. The words rang in my ears as clearly as if the figure had spoken them just seconds ago. I shook my head, trying to clear the sound from my mind. I had to leave, had to get far away from that place. But as I turned to walk, my legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the ground. Each step felt more laborious than the last, as though some invisible force was pulling me back toward the library. I stumbled, my feet betraying me as the world around me seemed to tilt, the darkness growing thicker, closing in from every direction. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay here. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how much I tried to escape, I felt the presence of the library looming over me. The walls of the street seemed to warp and bend, the houses distorting into grotesque shapes as I ran past them. The world felt wrong, like everything I knew was slipping through my fingers, unraveling before my eyes. I stumbled to a halt, my hands gripping the nearest street lamp as I gasped for air. My skin was slick with sweat, my entire body trembling, as though I were caught in the grip of some terrible fever. I looked around, trying to find something familiar, something that could anchor me to reality, but the world felt foreign. The street was empty, devoid of life, as if it had been abandoned long ago. The wind howled through the trees, and in the distance, I could hear a faint sound. A whisper, a hum, almost like a chant, echoing through the night. I turned in every direction, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive silence that seemed to stretch for miles. I was alone, completely alone, or so I thought. As I began to move again, my footsteps were interrupted by a soft, almost imperceptible sound behind me. It was a shuffle, a slow, deliberate dragging of feet across the pavement. My heart leapt into my throat, and my body froze. I didn't dare turn around, afraid of what I might see. But I couldn't ignore it. The sound grew louder, closer. A low guttural rasp like someone, or something, was dragging its feet through the dirt, closing the distance between us. My stomach twisted in fear. My body tense with dread, and against my better judgment, I turned around. There, standing at the end of the street, was the figure. The same tall, gaunt silhouette, its face obscured by the hood. Its eyes burned with an eerie, unnatural glow, and the faintest of smiles seemed to tug at the corners of its mouth. It was watching me. No, waiting for me. The whispers in my head grew louder, like 1,000 voices all crying out at once, desperate to warn me. You can't escape. I spun around, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be something I could do. I was panicking now, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the street, my legs moving on their own accord. The sound of dragging feet followed me, relentless, as though the figure was no longer trying to chase me, but was simply letting me run. The ground beneath me shifted again, warping and twisting, as if the very earth was fighting against me. I stumbled over the uneven pavement, my ankle twisting with a sharp pain that sent a jolt of terror through my body. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. I had to escape. As I reached the end of the street, I saw a faint light in the distance. A flickering street lamp, its bulb dim and flickering, casting long shadows across the road. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming in protest. But I couldn't stop now. I had to make it to that light. The figure was still behind me. I could feel it. Its presence hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. I was almost there, almost to safety. But as I reached the lamppost, my body collided with something cold and solid. A barrier. It was like running into a brick wall. I looked up, my eyes widening in horror. The library. It stood before me, looming larger than I had ever seen it. The doors, which I thought I had just closed behind me, were now wide open, beckoning me back inside. And standing in the doorway, the figure grinned. "You can't outrun fate," it said, its voice like gravel, grinding in the dark. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, as panic flooded my veins. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. Suddenly, the whispers grew deafening. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was hundreds, thousands, all swirling together in a cacophony of desperate pleas. I closed my eyes, but it didn't matter. The voices were inside my head, screaming, wailing, urging me to turn back, to leave, to forget everything that had happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to be here, that the library had already claimed me, that my fate was tied to its dark, cursed halls. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something happened. The ground beneath me cracked open with a deafening roar, splitting apart like the very earth was being torn asunder. From the gaping hole rose tendrils of darkness, writhing like serpents, twisting and coiling in the air. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the roar of the earth, the figure's laughter echoing around me like thunder. And then the tendrils reached for me. They wrapped around my limbs, their cold, slimy grip tightening with every passing second. I tried to scream, to fight, but the darkness pulled me deeper, dragging me toward the yawning chasm that had opened beneath me. I felt my body being pulled apart, my very essence being consumed by the darkness. "It's too late," the voice whispered in my ear as the world around me disappeared, swallowed by the blackness. I had come too far. I had entered a place I could never leave. The library's curse had claimed me, and I would never escape. The last thing I heard was the faint sound of a book closing. And then, nothing. I had spent the last few days recovering from the horrors I'd witnessed in the library, trying to convince myself that it was all just some twisted figment of my imagination. But the nightmares kept coming, each one more vivid than the last, as if the darkness that had gripped me in the library had never really let go. I woke up in a cold sweat every night, my heart racing, the whispers still ringing in my ears. But I couldn't tell anyone. I couldn't explain the terror I felt without sounding insane. So I kept my distance from everyone, from everything. I thought I had escaped, but the darkness was following me. One evening, I found myself back at the edge of town, where the old library stood, looming like a forgotten monument to a past I couldn't remember. I had promised myself I would never return, yet here I was, standing at the entrance once more. It was as if something was pulling me back, urging me to enter, to face whatever it was that haunted those cursed halls. I stood frozen, staring at the doors, wondering if I was losing my mind. I could hear my breath quickening, the adrenaline surging through my veins. My hands trembled as I reached for the brass handle, half expecting to feel something cold and unyielding, something that would stop me from going in. But the door opened with a creak, as though it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of old paper and dust filling my nostrils. The silence so thick it felt oppressive. The library was empty, just as I remembered, but somehow different, darker, more sinister. The once comforting rows of books seemed to stretch on forever, their spines twisted in unnatural ways, their pages fluttering in the unseen breeze. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and my mind screamed at me to turn around, to run as far as I could. But something kept me there, something deeper than fear. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't just in my head. They came from the shadows, from the corners of the room, curling around me like tendrils. They were calling me, beckoning me deeper into the darkness. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening to me, why the library was cursed, why it had such a hold over me. With each step I took, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow taller, closing in around me. I felt the weight of them pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, the thudding growing louder as I ventured further into the library, past the rows of bookshelves that seemed to stretch on forever. Every sound, every movement felt amplified, as though the very walls were alive and watching. And then I saw it, the book. It was perched on a pedestal at the far end of the library, bathed in a soft, eerie light. I felt an overwhelming pull toward it, like a magnet drawing me in, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of it, my hands trembling as I reached for the ancient tome. The book was bound in cracked leather, its surface etched with strange symbols I didn't recognize, and it hummed with an energy I couldn't explain. I opened it, and the world around me seemed to shift. The pages were filled with words that seemed to change as I read them, shifting and rearranging themselves into something darker, more twisted. The ink was wet, as if the words were still being written, still alive. I felt the power in the pages, a force so strong that it almost made me dizzy. It was like the book was calling to me, whispering secrets, offering me something dangerous. I turned the pages faster, my eyes scanning the words, desperate to uncover the truth. And then I saw it. An image. A figure, cloaked in shadows, its face obscured by darkness, its hands reaching toward me. I froze. It was the same figure that had haunted my nightmares, the same one that had followed me from the library. The whispers grew louder, louder still, as the figure's eyes seemed to burn through the pages, fixing me with an intense, unblinking gaze. And then I heard its voice. "You shouldn't have come back." It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled backward, dropping the book as it fell to the floor with a sickening thud. The figure was no longer just a drawing in the book. It was standing in front of me, its shadow stretching across the floor, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. I could feel its presence all around me, like it was filling the room, pushing the very air out of my lungs. It moved closer, its footsteps silent but unmistakable. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place, my mind screaming for me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't obey. And then it spoke again. "You've already made your choice. You cannot leave now." The room seemed to darken even further, the walls closing in as the figure reached out, its hand cold and clammy as it brushed against my cheek. I shuddered, my skin crawling with the cold touch of death itself. The whispers in my mind were deafening now, each voice screaming at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. The figure's hand wrapped around my throat, tightening with an unnatural strength as it lifted me off the ground, its face still hidden beneath the shadows. I gasped for air, my vision blurring, my chest tightening with each passing second. The pain was unbearable, and I could feel my body growing weaker, the edges of my consciousness slipping away. "This is your fate," the figure whispered, its voice colder than ice. "You will remain here, trapped in the dark, forever a part of this place." I fought against its grip, my hands clawing at its arm, but it was like trying to move through molasses. My strength was failing me, my body growing heavier by the second. I could feel my consciousness slipping, the darkness closing in around me. But even as I began to lose consciousness, I knew that it wasn't over. I wasn't dead. Not yet. And I would never escape. The library's curse had claimed me. And now, I was bound to it, just like all the others before me. With one final desperate scream, I felt everything fade to black. And then, nothing. In the distance, I could hear the sound of pages turning, faint whispers, and the creak of ancient wood. It was still watching. It was still waiting. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, as though I had just run a marathon. My heart pounded against my ribcage, and I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. The nightmares had been relentless, one after another, and each one felt more vivid than the last. The library's dark presence had followed me into my dreams, as if it were not satisfied with merely haunting my waking hours. The haunting whispers, the shadowy figure, it was all too real. I was still in my room, tangled in the blankets, the dim light of the early morning barely creeping through the curtains. For a moment, I just lay there, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. Was it just a dream? Or had it been something more? Something darker? Something that I couldn't explain? The terror I felt was unlike anything I had ever known, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the library still held me in its grasp, even now, far from its twisted walls. I thought about the figure, the shadow that had nearly claimed me in the library. That cold hand around my throat, the promises of an eternal cursed fate. It wasn't just some nightmare. It was a warning. The library was alive, and it was hungry. After what felt like hours of lying in bed, I finally gathered the strength to stand up. My legs felt weak, and my head throbbed with the remnants of the horrors that still clung to me. I didn't want to go back to the library, not ever, but the need to understand, to know what had happened, what had driven me to that place, was overwhelming. I had to go back. I had to face it once and for all. I didn't tell anyone about my decision. How could I? Who would believe me? Even I struggled to make sense of the nightmares, let alone the truth that I had experienced in the library. I gathered a few things: my bag, a flashlight, my phone, and a small notebook, and made my way to the door. The sun had just set, and the air was thick with an oppressive, almost suffocating weight. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the place that had nearly consumed me. As I approached the library, the familiar sense of dread began to fill me once again. The building loomed ahead, its Gothic structure more menacing than before. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to watch me as I approached, and the door creaked in protest when I touched the handle. My hand trembled, but I pushed it open, stepping inside. The air was stale, colder than it had been the last time I was here. The lights flickered weakly above me, casting long shadows on the walls. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. It felt as though the library had been waiting for me, as though it knew I would return, just as it had called to me that first night. I made my way to the center of the library, where the ancient pedestal stood, the same place where I had found the book, the cursed book. My hands shook as I approached it, but this time I wasn't afraid. I was resolute. I had to face it. I had to know what was hidden here, what the library was hiding, and what it wanted from me. The book was gone. The pedestal was empty. For a brief moment, I was struck by a wave of confusion. Had I imagined everything? Had it all just been some nightmare, a figment of my imagination? But then I heard it, the whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustle of paper in the wind, but it grew louder with every passing second. The shadows seemed to move, curling around me like dark tendrils. The whispers grew into words, words that I couldn't understand at first. But then, in a voice that sent chills through my spine, I heard it clearly. "You shouldn't have come back." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly to face the source of the voice. The figure was there. The same figure I had seen in my dreams, standing just at the edge of the shadows. Its face was still obscured, but I could feel its presence, its cold, malevolent energy pressing down on me. "You were warned," it said, its voice like 1,000 whispers combined into one. "You are mine now." I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. I turned to run, but my legs felt like lead. The shadows seemed to wrap around me, pulling me back toward the figure. It moved with unnatural speed, its form shifting in the dim light, growing larger, more terrifying with each passing moment. The library itself seemed to come alive, the walls closing in, the bookshelves creaking as though they were about to collapse. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was like the entire building was suffocating me, and I was helpless to stop it. I could hear the whispers now, growing louder, faster, as though they were coming from every corner of the room. The air was thick with an oppressive force, a weight that I couldn't escape. And then it reached out. Its hand was cold, like ice, as it wrapped around my wrist. The pain was unbearable, sharp, like 1,000 needles pricking into my skin. The shadows pressed in around me, and I felt the darkness consume me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I fought against it, struggling with every ounce of strength I had left. But it was no use. The figure's grip tightened, and I felt my strength fading. My vision blurred, and my body went numb. The last thing I saw, before everything went black, was the figure's eyes. Eyes that burned with an otherworldly fire, eyes that held a promise of eternal torment. I woke up again, just as I had before, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. My heart pounded, and my body shook with fear. But this time, it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. The library was still there, waiting, its darkness still calling to me, still holding me in its grip. I thought I had escaped. I thought I had freed myself from its curse. But I was wrong. The library owns me now. It claims everyone who dares to step inside. Once you enter its walls, you can never leave. The shadows are always watching, always waiting for the next soul to claim. And now, I'm a part of its story. Just like the others before me, the library will never let me go. And I will never leave. The darkness is eternal.